Welcome to the Steel Scorpion Sports Week 6 podcast. I'm your San Diego host, Jeff Miller.
And I'm your San Jose correspondent, Mark Heflin.
Well, Mark, for those that have been listening to our Guess the Line game, our homage to Bill Simmons and Cousin Sal, they're probably on the edge of their seat wondering what is Jeff going to name Mark's team for having won the line game. Well, I won't keep them in suspense any longer, or you. So, Mark, I know, being a big Colt fan and a big Peyton Manning fan, that this one will be near and dear to your heart. Your new team name is Tom Brady is greater than Peyton Manning. And is greater, you can use the little is greater sign. It's the one that Tom Brady and then the little arrow would be pointing towards Peyton Manning. The mouth would be going because the mouth is towards the bigger side. You might remember that from elementary school.
Yeah, I do, but those two keys, I'm looking at the keyboard right now, those two keys are right next to each other, so it might, there's a chance I might accidentally fat finger and do Tom Brady is less than Peyton Manning, and that would be true, of course, but...
Well, Tom Brady has 3, and 3 is the magic number, and 3 is bigger than 1. So just to be clear, all of those facts are true.
True, but I could also list facts from his first Super Bowl where he threw for about 140 yards and still was somehow named the MVP, and about the fact that football is a team game and he's one of 22 starters. And I could go mention many other stats, but I will be a good sport. I will staunchly defend until the day that I die that Peyton Manning is a better quarterback than Tom Brady. So I'll be a good sport. I'll take my medicine. I will change my team name. You won fair and square, unfortunately. So I will change it. And like I mentioned on the Guess the Lines podcast, that maybe it'll be a good thing. My previous team name was certainly doing me no favors. My team, despite having promise in my mind, has vastly underperformed. So maybe this new team name will somehow give the team a spark.
That's right. Maybe Tom Brady will light a fire under them. And at worst, maybe Giselle will come visit you because you've accepted that Tom Brady is so good. So that's a win-win in my book.
There are worse things that could happen than that, yes.
Yes, and we won't tell anyone. Don't worry. Hopefully no one listens in the Heflin household to this podcast.
Yeah.
But on to bigger and better things, especially for you, since now your team mascot is Tom Brady, the ever good-looking Tom Brady. But let's dive into Week 6. Were there any trends from the week that you wanted to point out, or anything that took you by surprise from the outcome of Week 6?
The one thing that stood out to me the most as I was watching the games and then looking at some of the box scores is just how much trouble some teams have in running. And I started noticing some of the rushing stats, and so then I just went through every box score and was looking. And in Week 6, there were 30 teams that played because there were 2 teams on bye, and 14 of the 30 teams, almost half, averaged less than 4 yards a carry. And I won't go over the rushing stats of all 14 of them, but some of the ones that really stood out. The Pats had 27 rushes for 50 yards. The Jets had 15 rushes for 31 yards. The Falcons had 13 rushes for 42 yards. The Bills had 23 rushes for 68 yards, and the Colts had 35 rushes for a whopping 93 yards. So if you were doing the math in your head on some of those, you were seeing that not only were they less than 4 yards a carry, but many of those were less than 3 yards per carry. So I started thinking about that and how, so much trouble rushing the ball. And from a fantasy perspective, are you almost better off taking wide receivers? Are they safer? Obviously, you're going to take some wide receivers, but I'm even wondering, are we going to start seeing a trend in drafts, starting in 2015, 2016, where we see a lot more wide receivers going in the first round? I think in this past few years, you've probably seen 1 or 2. A few years ago, I think Megatron was maybe the only wide receiver going in the first round. Now, this year, sometimes you would see maybe 2 or 3 plus Jimmy Graham. And I just wonder, within a few years, are we going to see, half or maybe 7 or so of the first rounders be wide receivers?
Yeah, and I think part of that will depend on your scoring system. If you have a PPR, half-point PPR, three-quarter-point PPR, obviously the wide receiver inherently starts with some value in your mind. If you think an average game for a wide receiver, he's going to catch 5 balls. In a half-point PPR, you're already starting with a baseline of 2.5. So that would add a little of safety, as you're saying there. I think what really will be the key, and this is true of the running backs and the wide receivers, is guys that get the ball. So if they're guys that are guaranteed to touch the ball X number of times, and in your mind that might be 10 times at the wide receiver position, they're going to get 10 targets and 20 combined touches at the running back position. While you may get a low yards per carry, the chance of something good happening is probably up. So I think that's really what you're going to see more than just ignoring the running back completely. Especially if you look at this year, who were the wide receivers that were drafted early? Megatron, AJ Green. I believe both of them sat out this week, and Megatron has done nothing all season. AJ Green is likely out a game or two more, hasn't been setting the world on fire. So again, no guarantee that you're getting safety even by going wide receiver.
Well, as a big Megatron fan, I feel compelled to point out that he did have a big week one against the Giants, and there's done nothing since then. So let's not get carried away and say he's done nothing all season.
Yes, my fault. I forgot that your second favorite player after Peyton Manning and every Colt is Megatron. Speaking of the Colts, you did mention them in the rushing stats, and I feel obligated to say that any team that gives the ball to Trent Richardson is almost asking to have a yards per carry below that 4 threshold. They're almost taunting you that, yes, we can get 2.5 yards per carry and still beat you.
Yeah, I think, when you give that, Richardson had 17 carries for 41 yards in week 6, and I think at this point the Colts are just happy to get more than 3 yards per carry, and I think they kind of rely on Andrew Luck to bring up the yards per carry average. But you mentioned the PPR and kind of the trends going forward. I think it was not that long ago, maybe only 8 to 10 years ago, something like that, that PPR really started sprouting up in fantasy leagues, and the main reason that it came about was because running backs were so highly valued versus receivers, and they needed some way to kind of make receivers be more equal in value to running backs. And I think now we've seen such a shift, the trend away from running games, where now you don't even see running backs going in the first round of the NFL draft anymore, and receivers being so valuable. I wonder if we'll get to the point, a few years from now, when people say, well, we need to even things out again, and then we're going to start seeing PPC leagues where you start seeing points per carry. Do you think there's any possibility of that?
I'll go with no. I won't join that league if it ever exists. Imagine, if you will, that you were Trent Richardson, as you said there. The fact that you get over 10 carries guarantees you 5 points if it's a half-point PPC. That seems a little ridiculous, because even in a bad running team, you'll probably carry the ball 10 to 12 times. And a good running back, look at DeMarco Murray this year, he's over 20 carries a week on average. That means you're starting with a baseline of 10 before he gains a yard. So, no, I don't think that'll happen. What I think might happen, and you're right, wide receivers start to become more valuable. You might see full point PPRs go down to half point, or 3/4 point go down to half. I think the half point may become the standard, because it does seem to balance things out a little bit. For full disclosure, that's what we do at Steel Scorpion Sports. We give the half point for the reception, and it does seem that our receiving values and our rushing values do end up more in line, so you have a good mix of when to draft running backs and receivers.
Great point, and that is the reason that we use the half point PPR, because it does make the point system more equal between the running backs and the receivers, because the full point PPR just really shifts things towards wide receivers.
Yeah, and I know we mentioned the Colts in there, and that leads me to another thing I want to discuss this week, Mark, and that's the AFC playoff picture. We discussed this 2 weeks ago, that there were probably 7 teams after week 4 we thought could make the playoffs in the AFC. After week 6, I'm tempted to say that we already know the 6 playoff teams.
I think it was even after week 3, because I remember being so surprised we were that early into the season and knowing the teams. And I think it was after week 3 that we said, okay, out of these 7 teams, and it was the Patriots, Ravens, Steelers, Colts, Broncos, and Chargers. And we had said that, the pool of 6 AFC playoff teams is going to come from those 7. And then, you and I were talking, and I think after week 6, we can definitively say that, the Steelers, they don't look like a playoff team this year. They're having some offensive issues. Ben Roethlisberger isn't looking as good as his normal standard. And they've had some injuries on defense that are hurting the team. Obviously, they just went into Cleveland, just kind of got destroyed. So I think we could drop them from the list and get down to 6. And for those 6 remaining teams, I feel pretty confident that those are the 6 teams that are going to represent the AFC. Now, we just mentioned Steelers, Browns. The Browns, being at 3-2, could potentially, if we had to pick a new 7th team instead of the Steelers, the Browns are not only 3-2, but then the next 3 games are at Jacksonville versus Oakland versus Tampa Bay. They could, not only could, but they should theoretically be 6-2 at the halfway point.
Yeah, if you get to 6-2, wow, you'd have a great chance. Unfortunately for them, they don't play Pittsburgh anymore this season. That seems to be the best team for them to match up with. They won't have any games with Tennessee where they can come back from 28 points down or whatever ridiculous figure that was. But I do think you're right. I think one of the Ravens or Bengals will win the AFC North. The Patriots are going to win the East. The Colts are going to win the South. And the Broncos and Chargers, one will win the West, and the other will be the wild card. Maybe the Browns make it in. Houston, I think we've soured on a bit the past few weeks. Maybe they turn it around, but I just don't see how that's going to happen. So I think, as you said, 6 playoff teams, the 6 spots, they look pretty well defined.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, I would, if it were legal to play such a wager, I feel pretty confident those are probably the 6 teams. The NFC, a little more up in the air. We can discuss them on a future podcast. Maybe look at them kind of at the halfway point of the NFL season. Maybe after week 8, we'll have a better idea of who's going to be the 6 playoff teams there. But these are definitely much more up in the air in the NFC than in the AFC.
Yeah, I think at this point about half the NFC can make it, so probably not worth discussing the playoff potential of every team except for Washington and Tampa.
True.
All right, well, I like that, and I do like your thinking that if it were possible to bet, we could bet the 6 after 6, as we'll call it, the 6 playoff teams after week 6. But luckily, there's no such thing as legalized gambling, so we won't worry about that. That leads me to my next point, and just quickly wanted to touch on a couple things that have happened. I mentioned the Calvin Johnson and A.J. Green injuries, and it does seem wide receiver injuries have been in the news quite a bit this week. And Mark, I know you wanted to mention and discuss a little the situation that we've seen with Marvin Jones and a few other players.
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting from a fantasy standpoint. I think a lot of teams probably drafted Marvin Jones kind of late in the draft. I know in our Jaguar League, he went in the 14th round. I think if he had been healthy coming into the season, he probably would have been somewhere in the 8-9 round range. He had a pretty decent season last year. He was expected to have a pretty good season this year as a number 2 Bengals receiver behind A.J. Green. So, people thought they were getting some value. They're going to stash him on their roster for the first few weeks, and he was expected to come back in week 5 after their week 4 bye. And, it turns out it was announced today that he's been placed on IR. So it's just unfortunate for those owners that were, not only using up a roster space for these past few weeks, as well as, a draft slot that they could have used to take someone else. And instead, they got zero value out of it whatsoever. And then some other injury news for this week. Of course, Noshan Moreno was placed on the IR today. Victor Cruz was placed on the IR today. Don't know if officially Stephen Ridley has been placed on the IR yet. The Patriots are probably trying to figure out some way to release the message through Morse code or wait until, Thursday night at 1 a.m. or something with their weird tactics with their injury reports and not trying to be upfront with people. So I'm not sure exactly what they're doing there, but definitely a few more injuries this week that are relevant to fantasy players.
Yeah, and the opposite of the Patriots, I think, would be the Bengals. They've already announced A.J. Green won't be playing in Week 7 against the Colts, whereas Bill Belichick would have just said, we're moving on to Indy, we're moving on to Indy, we're moving on to Indy at that point. Also, the Lions have mentioned Megatron likely out, not just this upcoming week, but maybe the next 2 games prior to the bye week, maybe bring him back after the bye. So you're potentially looking at no Megatron for the next 4 weeks. That's a big hit to any of the teams that obviously used a first-round pick on Megatron and either a first or early second-round pick on A.J. Green. Losing them right in the heart of the season, that can't help your playoff push.
Yeah, for sure. I'll save the suspense for later, but we have a team in our Jaguar League that actually has both of those guys to go in the first 2 rounds. So we'll discuss their potential going forward.
All right, well, with that, you mentioned discussing the leagues. So we are at the midway point. We're through 6 weeks of our multiplier leagues at steelscorpionsports.com. So why don't we start by having an evaluation of these leagues and see where we stand at the midway point, how some of the teams are doing, what trends you might have spotted in a different league, and any of the interesting tidbits you find. And we'll start with our Leopard League. So Mark, I'll let you lead us through the Leopard League, and then I'll take us through the Jaguar, and then you can finish up with the Jellyfish.
All right, sounds good. So, yeah, the Leopard League, like you said, was drafted live on the radio. It is War Room Fantasy Sports Radio. Been on with them a few times. Was on with them again last night to kind of do a halfway through the season recap. If you want to listen to their podcast, it can be found at blogtalkradio.com/War Room. That's one word for War Room. So give them a listen, check them out. But that league is looking pretty competitive. They're at the top. They have two teams that are tied with 46 wins, and then we have a couple teams that are tied for the last playoff spot. So just to give people a reminder, 12-team leagues, the top 5 teams make the playoffs, and then the playoffs runs week 13 to week 16. It's an all-play format, and then you start with a little bit of a bonus number of wins based on your spot in the standings. So at the top of the standings in the Leopard League, like I said, we have two teams tied. We have Keller Kid with 46 wins, and we have the Mofos with 46 wins. Both of these are pretty good teams. Keller Kid is owned by Rodney Weehee, and as we know, he is a very good fantasy player. Been in leagues with him many times. I've never not seen him make the playoffs. So you can pretty much put it in the books that this team will make the playoffs. He's a perennial contender. Second, we have the Mofos, again, with 46 wins. This team is riding the strength of having the number one running back and tight end, of course, that being DeMarco Murray and Julius Thomas. But they're a little weak at QB, and this team had Stephen Ridley, who just got injured and is probably out for the season. And they have Jimmy Graham, who's going to miss the next few weeks as well, probably 2 to 3 weeks. So this team might start to slide in the standings a little bit just based on some injuries. And third, we have a team called Taco, which is a tribute to the league on FXX, if you watch that show. That team has 42 wins. The team looks pretty solid, but he's multiplied all of his really good players already, or most of them anyway. He still has Des Bryant and Brandon Marshall that he can multiply, but he might start to slide back a little bit as well. In fourth place, we have Grumpy Munchkins with 40 wins. And this team has a pretty good roster, but they've already multiplied Andrew Luck, Eddie Lacy, and Antonio Brown, and they've used both of their 3Xs. So we'll see how that plays out, but they're going to have to try to hang on, given the fact that they've used those multipliers. And in week 6, in fact, this team only had 1 win, so they slid back in the standings a little bit. In fifth place, we have Scorpion King with 37 wins. It's a solid team. But he used his 3X, or one of his first 3X, on Gio Bernard against the Patriots. Did not get a good game out of that. He probably wishes he could have that back. Did not get the results that he was expecting. And then tied with him for the last playoff spot at this point is the War Room Fantasy Sports Radio team owned by Anthony Amiano. He also has 37 wins. He's got a lot of rookies on his team. He needs Bishop Stanky to start getting more playoff time, as well as Devontae Adams. If so, then his team could do well. But he has used both of his 3X multipliers. He hasn't multiplied Demaryius Thomas yet, so if he finds a good week to get some points out of a Demaryius Thomas multiplier, he could move up in the standings. He's had 11 wins each of the last 2 weeks. And then the next few teams after that, we have Big Ol' TDs, SurvivorNFL.com, Romosexuals, Funsucker, Shane Falco, and Pumped Up Kickers. The 11th place team is Shane Falco with 26 wins, but he had 12 wins in week 6. And in fact, the 11th place team is just 11 wins out of a playoff spot, which in the all-play format can be made up fairly quickly. A few more things to point out in this league is that 5 of the top 6 teams have all had a week where they've had 3 wins or less. I think one of the misconceptions of an all-play league where you get, 11 wins, for the top scoring team and 0 wins for the bottom scoring team is that if you have a bad week, if you have a week of 0, 1, 2, 3 wins, something like that, that it's really going to hurt you, impact your chances of making the playoffs. It's not true. I think it's kind of one of those myths or misconceptions. Like I said, 5 of the top 6 teams have had a week where they've had a week of 3 wins or less. And then, let's see, we've had 4 different teams that have had a 12-win week, and of course a 12-win week is possible from having finished with the top score, so you get 11 wins, and then we have yardage wins as well. And 3 of the 4 teams that have had a 12-win week are currently outside of the playoffs. So that's kind of the corollary, the opposite of what I just mentioned as far as teams that have bad weeks. Even having a great week, if you have a week with 12 wins, doesn't necessarily mean that you're just going to vault to the top of the standings and be in contention. 3 of the 4 that have had are currently sitting outside of the playoffs. But I think one of the great things about the on-play format is here we are in week 6. 11 of the 12 teams still have a very legitimate chance of making the playoffs. Even the 12th place team is currently 19 games out of the final playoff spot. With the 6 games to go and the opportunity to win, 11 or 12 games in a single week, essentially all of these teams are still in it. And so, in a head-to-head league in week 6, if you're 0-6, even if you're 1-5, and even 2-4, if you're 2-4 at week 6, you're looking at needing to finish out probably 6-2 the rest of the way in order to make the playoffs. But in this format, much more fluid, much more chance to make it down in a hurry. And I think that's the recap for the Leopard League.
All right. So that was a good recap, and it's interesting to see that we have teams going all the way from the 46 wins down to the 17, as you said. And I think from past experience, both of us could speak to this. In an all-play format, making up the ground from, say, the 17 or 20 win plateau at the halfway point to the playoff spot is not insurmountable. You particularly have some experience doing this in 2 of the last 3 years. So I think you're right. The misconception might be out there that when you're in an all-play format, you have a week where you get a 0, and we'll discuss that when we get to the Jaguar League here in a moment. But if you have a week with a 0, it doesn't eliminate you from the playoffs. In fact, why don't we jump into the Jaguar League, and I'll show an example of where having a 0 week actually hasn't hindered someone from being near the top of the standings at all. So quick recap of the standings here finds Funsucker, Dave, in first place with 51 wins. Now you'll notice from one league to another, in the Leopard League we had 46 wins leading the way. In the Jaguar League you have 51 wins, so it's slightly better at the top. The Funsuckers are doing a great job. It's been consistently good. They are one of the few teams that haven't had really any horrible weeks. They've been in the 9, 10, 11 range most of the time. One week where they did get 4 wins. So again, reconfirming what you said earlier, Mark. But right now they're riding Jamal Charles and Arian Foster with Aaron Rodgers. And that's a great combination, assuming that Charles and Foster stay healthy, which most fantasy owners would probably not believe will happen. So there's still some belief that even though Funsucker is sitting at 51 wins, there's a good chance that an injury hits, they may come back a little towards the pack. And in this case, the pack is only 1 win behind them. That would be Sweet Revenge, a very solid team, I have to say. Although this team did have a 0 win, as I was just describing. In week 3, horrible week for all of their players, and by theirs I mean mine, since I am Sweet Revenge. I got a 0 in week 3, and there I am with 50 wins after week 6. So I would clearly be leading the other league with a 50 win total, and I had a 0 win week. So again, a 0 win week does not kill you, and a 12 win week, as Mark, you pointed out in the last league, doesn't guarantee you a spot in the playoffs either. My team, I will admit, I am riding DeMarco Murray as hard as the Cowboys are. It's the number 1 scoring running back. I've got Steve Smith, which has been a pleasant surprise at wide receiver, along with Demaryius Thomas, and I've got a couple of top 10 quarterbacks at this point. So other than that week 3 dud, I am the highest scoring team in the league, getting 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 wins. So things are looking good at me in my corner. I also have one 3x multiplier remaining, so feeling pretty good about my standing in life. In third place in our league, you drop all the way down to 40 wins. So you went 51, 50, and now the pack. 40 wins for Kramerica Industries. I love that name, but they're sitting at 40 wins in third place. They may run into a little bit of a challenge here, though, Mark. As you said earlier, this is the team that's holding Megatron and AJ Green. So having your first two draft picks out, it did make a noticeable drop in week 6. They'd been doing the 13, 7, 10 type of performance and fell down to a 5 in week 6. This could be the next couple weeks of hardship for them, and that could put them behind the 8 ball, because right behind them is a group of 3 teams tied at 36 wins. That would be the Keller Card Shark, the Shanialators, and Giving Ends to My Friends. So all these teams, they have pluses and minuses, obviously sitting at 36. One of them belongs to Rodney, who you mentioned in the other league. Rodney, a perennial playoff team, and he has both of his 3x multipliers left. The only one of the top 9 in our league that still has both 3x multipliers left. So while he is tied for the last playoff position currently, you have to like his chances, and his team is pretty strong, especially at wide receiver. The Shanialators has Andrew Luck and Antonio Brown. Great combination. Unfortunately, I believe both have been multiplied, so the running back by pickup is not working. That means picking up a new running back every week and trying to start them. It doesn't work very well, especially if you're finding people like Storm Johnson. So the Shanialators may have some challenges going forward, holding on to that top spot, because right behind him, Giving Ends to My Friends, who was tied at 36, has LaShawn McCoy, and he finally is starting to produce like a number 1 back. So if he does that, what we saw this past week going forward, I could easily see him rising up the charts. Also, Le'Veon Bell and Jordy Nelson helping carry that team, so good all around. Then after the battle for the playoff position, you have the Yada Yada Yadas at 35 wins. Again, just 1 win back of that three-team tie for the last playoff position. Lord Helmet at 32, Waduk at 31, No D in Dallas at 24, the FTA Wrecking Crew at 24, and a team named Tom Brady is greater than Peyton Manning, bringing up the rear at 19. So a couple of interesting tidbits I wanted to point out on the league in general. We do have that 3-way tie for the final 2 playoff spots. So right now, there's a team 1 game back of them as well. So you have 4 teams that really are vying for 2 spots through week 6. I mean, that's pretty impressive to see how tightly bunched the middle is. And even beyond that, you get to 32, 31. So really tightly bunched in the middle. Our bottom 3 teams, though, all have both 3x multipliers left. So that'll be interesting to see if that can propel the bottom teams up towards the playoff line and get them into that 5th spot. And again, you mentioned this earlier, Mark, but I want to reiterate, all of our current playoff teams have had a week of 4 wins or less. And 3 of the 5 teams sitting in playoff spots right now have had multiple weeks with 4 wins or less. So it's impressive to see that you can have a bad week or 2, but in an all-play format, a couple good weeks offsets that. As long as you have some average weeks mixed in, you can be in playoff contention. Whereas you mentioned in a head-to-head league, if you went out and posted one of the 2 or 3 lowest scores in the league a couple times and then had bad luck in another week, you're already down to 2 and 4, and it's going to be tough to make the playoffs. So that's another interesting tidbit about why we think that the all-play format at Steel Scorpion Sports is better. Then the last tidbit, it's similar to what you said in the other league, Mark. We're at the midway point of the season, and realistically, 11 of the 12 have serious playoff contention, being less than 12 wins out of the playoffs, which, as we've seen, you can have a 12 or 13 win week, so they could be closing that gap in no time. And even the team in last place, Tom Brady is greater than Peyton Manning, being 17 out of the last playoff spot, has a chance, again with the 2-3x multipliers, good timing, needs some breakout seasons to start happening for some of the younger players drafted, the 2nd and 3rd year players that were expected to perform better than they have. But, I mean, I wouldn't even write off Tom Brady is greater than Peyton Manning. And at the halfway point of a head-to-head league, I would say in a 12-team league, you've probably already written off 4 teams.
Yeah, that's true. And I'm going to now try to defend that last place team that is unfortunately named Tom Brady is greater than Peyton Manning. That is actually my team. I think I have a pretty good roster when I look at my, I have Jay Cutler, one of my highest scoring fantasy QBs. I have Carson Palmer, who just came back. I have Eddie Lacy, who obviously has underperformed so far, but he's had some tough matchups. Hopefully he gets better going forward. We'll see. Andre Ellington, Alshon Jeffrey, Michael Floyd, Golden Tate, Kendall Wright, Cordero Patterson has certainly been a disappointment so far, but I have some talent there. Like you said, I haven't used either of my 3Xs yet. And shipping for me in week 6 this past week, I had the highest projection out of all 12 teams. I was projected to finish above every other team in the league and came in last. I don't know what to say about that. The interesting is, for yardage wins, we have yardage wins where a team gets a yardage win if they start the player with the most passing yards, most rushing yards, and most receiving yards. And I think when people hear that, they think it's just going to always go to the highest, the teams that are already getting the 9, 10, or 11 wins every week. And definitely not the case. You usually see it spread out throughout the standings in a given week. And in fact, I'm a perfect example of that in week 6 for the lowest scoring team. So I had 0 wins based on the actual standings on the points. But I took up the yardage win. I had Jay Cutler. He threw for 370-some yards, something like that. So actually, despite being the worst team in the league in week 6 point-wise, I still picked the win with Jay Cutler. But yeah, at the bottom of the standings right now, we'll see how it comes out. I think I have a turnaround in me. Two other little tidbits I wanted to point out was, this is a league that we've been running offline for 3 years before bringing it over to Steel Scorpion, and 2 of the members are having quite big turnaround seasons versus last year. So the league leader right now, Funsucker, owned by David Henson, he finished last year with 60 wins total for the whole season through 12 weeks. He's got 51 through week 6, so he's almost at his total from last year, halfway through the season. And even more impressively, the Yada Yada Yadas, owned by Tommy Glasspool, last year he finished the season with 31 wins for the whole season, and now here we are in week 5, and he has 35 wins already. So quite a good turnaround for him. Happy to see his team doing well, and right now he's 1 game out of the playoffs. We'll see how he ends up doing, but definitely quite the impressive performance compared to last year.
That's right. Way to go, Tommy. And also, way to go, Dave. And way to go, Jeff, sitting in second place, only 1 game behind. Sweet revenge is indeed getting some sweet revenge.
Compare and contrast the Jaguar League and the Leopard League. In the Jaguar League, you still have 4 teams that haven't used a 3X yet. In the Leopard League, you only have 2 teams that have yet to use a 3X. And the other thing I found really interesting, in the Jaguar League, every single team has at least 1 3X left. No one has used both of the 3Xs. In the Leopard League, you only have 4 of the 12 teams that have used both of their 3Xs through week 6. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Again, as a recap, you have a multiplier each week, the 12 weeks of the regular season. 10 of them are your normal double multipliers where you're doubling the fantasy points of your player. And then 2 of them are special 3X multipliers. So just interesting as far as how people have used them in those 2 leagues. And you mentioned the mulligan. We had a really interesting situation in the Leopard League in week 6. So actually the War Room Fantasy Sports Radio team, owned by Anthony Ariano, he had a situation that I hadn't even really, considered as far as mulligan usage. I usually think of it as you're taking a high-performing player from your bench and you're using it to swap in for a low-performing starter. And he actually used it. He was in a situation where he had Brandon Lloyd starting in the Monday night game. And Brandon Lloyd was only projected for 3.2 points. He's like, the 4th wide receiver for the Niners. But he had Devontae Adams on his bench, who didn't have a great game. He only had 10.7 points. But the scores were bunched up enough. If he chose to use the mulligan, he would gain, 10.7 points because Brandon Lloyd had not played yet, which would get him 3 extra wins. But if he chose not to use it, then Brandon Lloyd, even if he got 7.9 points, that would get him no additional wins. But yet, 10.7 points from his mulligan got him 3 extra wins. So he decided to go ahead and pull the trigger. He used the mulligan. He put in Devontae Adams for a player that was yet to play, who was going to play in the Monday night game. He picked up those 3 extra wins. And then, for anyone that remembers, if they saw the Monday night game, Brandon Lloyd, on a fluke play at the very end of the first half, he only had 1 catch the entire game. But as it turned out, that 1 catch was an 80-yard touchdown catch. So that 1 play was worth 14.5 points. 8 points from the 80 yards, 6 points for the touchdown, half point for the reception. And those 14.5 points would have gotten him the same 3 wins that he got by using his mulligan. Unfortunately, now he no longer has his mulligan. But I thought that was a very interesting strategic decision of using your mulligan for a player that hadn't even played yet.
Yeah, I guess we had never even thought of that because you would never envision, unless you had the biggest breakout performance and you had your weakest player left, or perhaps if it was just a single position like a tight end. If you had Antonio Gates on the bench the week he scored the 3 touchdowns and your tight end hadn't gone yet, I guess you would swap him out knowing you're not going to beat that performance. But that is an interesting use of the mulligan. And we've seen the mulligan used in every league. It's only been used one time in the jellyfish, which you can get to in a minute. So it is a tool that teams have taken advantage of. I know you could pick up 3, 4, 5. We've even seen 6 wins off of mulligan, I believe. So another thing that you can do at Steel Scorpion Sports that you can't do anywhere else is replace somebody that underperformed with somebody on your bench that did great. But you can do it one time all season. So it's a great lever to pull, but you only get to pull it once.
And I think that's one of the best things that I like about it is that you only get one. So it's not like every single week you go in knowing that, okay, if I don't set my lineup correctly, I can still use my mulligan. No, you get one for the whole season. And that also has a strategic element of, okay, when am I going to use it? What do I expect to get out of it as far as number of wins? And the most that we've seen so far was someone, I think, in the Leopard League got 6 wins out of using their mulligan, which was actually from Antonio Gates that you mentioned earlier. I think on average we've seen teams get around 3 to 4 wins out of a mulligan. But now that we're getting to the second half of the fantasy season, it starts to become, you can't be as picky with using your mulligan as you get closer, week 8, week 9, week 10. At that point, if you can get 2 wins out of it, if you're in week 10, let's say, and you can get 2 wins out of using your mulligan, do you pull the trigger? Or do you wait and then hope that in week 11 or 12 you can get 3 or more wins out of it? I think that's going to be a interesting scenario that we see play out in the last few weeks of the regular season.
Yeah, I agree. It's going to be interesting to see how the first full season of Steel Scorpion Sports plays out. But keep coming back, sports fans, and check us out, and you'll find out. And with that, Mark, let's go through the final league, the Jellyfish League. So take us through the standings there, and this, for those that don't remember, is a free contest league that Mark and I are participating in, where if you beat one of our teams, you'll get a free $50 entry for next season. And if you beat both of our teams, you'd get a free $150 entry into one of our leagues next season.
Yeah, so the Jellyfish League, good intro, like you just said. The fact that it's a free league, unfortunately, I think we've had 3 teams that seem like they have kind of neglected the roster and stopped paying attention. Those 3 teams are 3 of the bottom 4 teams. I think it's a situation where, players probably have a lot of different fantasy teams, so a lot of people are in, 4 or more leagues, and, they paid nothing to be in it, so maybe they forget about it. But the one good aspect of it, from an all-play format versus head-to-head, at least from an all-play format, everyone benefits from these 3 teams, if you want to call them orphan teams that are kind of neglected. These orphan teams benefit everyone else equally, versus in the head-to-head format, if they were trying in the first few weeks and then they kind of forgot about it and gave up, then from a head-to-head standpoint, then they're only benefiting the teams that are playing them in that specific week, and it's an automatic win for those teams, where the other teams having to, fight each other for a win. But in the all-play format, everyone benefits equally. As far as looking at the standings, these are the most bunched standings out of any of the 3 leagues. The top team has 46 wins, which is the same as in the Leopard League. The top team has 46. But the bottom team only has 20. So it's fairly bunched up. In fact, the 5 teams that would currently qualify for the playoffs are separated by 5 whole wins. Top team with 46, the 5th team with 41. So definitely bunched up. I think we're going to see a lot of movement over the last 6 weeks as these teams kind of jumble through with their multipliers and the points, and we'll see how these teams shake out. But a recap so far, right now, your team is in first place. You have 46 wins. You have both of your 3 X's remaining, and you're still able to multiply a lot of your best players. I was looking at your roster in pretty fine shape for making the playoffs. I am the second place team with 44 wins. I also have both of my 2Xs remaining, and a lot of my good players that I can still multiply as well. I can still multiply Cutler, Carson Palmer, Des Bryant, Randall Cobb, a little bit mediocre in running backs in this league, but I think my wide receivers are good enough that are going to carry me through. And like I said, I have both of my 3Xs as well. In third place, we have a team called Really Impressive Team Name. That team has 42 wins. That team may struggle a little bit going forward. They just lost Noshawn Moreno and Marvin Jones on the same day. They were both on his roster and both put on the IR today. So certainly that's going to hurt his team a little bit. Though obviously he now has some free agent dollars that he can go out, and he has 2 roster spots that just opened up. But he's already multiplied Aaron Rodgers. But I thought it was interesting. He only used a 2X on Aaron Rodgers. I think normally you would expect that you would use one of your 3Xs. QBs tend to be more consistent in their scoring. It's a little bit less risky to use a 3X on a QB because even on a bad day, their QB is going to put up some points. Whereas, if you use a 3X on a running back or a wide receiver, there's a chance that they may not have hardly any points, but at least with the QB, you're getting some. But it was interesting that he only used a 2X on Aaron Rodgers. In fourth place, we have Unknown and Dangerous, also with 42 wins. This team has a pretty solid roster. They've used one of their 3Xs, but they've already multiplied all of their top players other than Alfred Morris and Tony Romo. So we'll see if this team is able to hang on. In fifth place, we have Dial It Down a Notch. This team seems to be making a surge. They had 11 wins in week 6. They currently have the top projection for week 7. This team has a pretty solid core. Matt Forte, Gio Bernard, and Julius Thomas. So this team looks pretty safe for making the playoffs as well. But they're just 3 wins ahead of the 6th place team. He Hate Me. That team has 38 wins. They still have both of their 3Xs. This is a team that's being carried by DeMarco Murray, but this team also has A.J. Green. They're going to be without last week and this week, and maybe a little bit more than that. So we'll see if this team starts to fade a little bit. And in 7th place, we have Turned Down for Watt with 36 wins. This team has both of the 3X remaining. This team, when I look at the roster, it's nothing special. They don't have a ton of great players, but I think they've had pretty good multiplier timing. They've had some good performances out of their multipliers, which has kept this team in contention. But they have already multiplied, Drew Brees, Blake Bortles, and Eddie Lacy. But with both 3Xs remaining, this team might still have a chance. After that, we have a little bit of a drop-off. We have, I guess the next team has 35 wins. They haven't multiplied any of their QBs yet, but they have Megatron, who's injured, and this team has used both of the 3Xs and most of their free agent budget. So this team might have a hard time catching up with some of the other playoff teams. Then we have a little bit of a drop off to this bottom 4 teams with 26, 23, 21, and 20. And like I said at the top, I think some of those teams have kind of given up, but at least in an all-play format, it benefits everyone equally. As far as the 5 teams that are currently qualified for the playoffs, each of them has had a week of 2 or less wins. So, not to harp on it too much, we've already mentioned it, but a bad week does not kill you by any means. Especially given that each of the playoff teams so far has had a week of 2 or less wins. So, the one thing to point out in this league that was kind of interesting, in the other 2 leagues, the most wins that we've seen in a week by a given team is 12. So a team that finished with the highest points and then also picked up one of the yardage wins. In this league, we actually had a team with 13 wins in week 3, where they had the highest points to pick up the 11 all-play wins, and then they also had 2 yardage wins. I'm not sure which players they were. I didn't go back and check, but so far that's the most wins that we've seen in any given week. And that is the wrap-up of the Jellyfish League.
Yeah, as you said before, Mark, it's interesting when you see the bad week not hindering teams from making the playoffs. A 2-win week or less, 1 win I see on a couple of those. The 0 win for me in the Jaguar League, it doesn't stop you in an all-play format from being in playoff contention. And conversely, a 13-win team in week 3, not in the playoffs currently. So having a great week doesn't help either. You have to do it over time. But the benefit is, if you have bad schedule luck and a bad week or two, it doesn't knock you out of the playoffs. By week 6, as I said before, in a head-to-head league, and we've all been in these leagues, 12-team league, 3 or 4 of the teams are out by week 6 because they're sitting at 1-5. They're sitting at 2-4, 0-6, have one injury, and just would have to go 6 or 7 straight weeks with wins, and it's just not going to happen. So the all-play format, you just have to start improving. You have to use your multiplier timing properly. As you said about one of the teams, the roster wasn't great, but if you hit the multiplier correctly, suddenly you're right there at the playoff position. And so, Mark, after that recap, any other thoughts on the Steel Scorpion Sports inaugural season you want to bring up?
We'll get back to that in a second, but do you want to go over the multiplier and the employee of the week?
I did indeed. As with every podcast, we like to give kudos to the team that made best use of the multiplier, I should say. So, Mark, why don't you take us through the multiplier of the week?
I think we have to go with Matt Forte on this one. We had a team that used a 3X on Matt Forte. They got a great week out of him. I think he had around 30 fantasy points, and so obviously that was a huge bonus for that team, and they did quite well for the week.
Yeah, I think that timing's pretty perfect. I believe that was his high watermark for the season, and you can't rightfully expect 30 points of almost any player when you multiply them. I think if you hit 20, you're happy, right? 30, that's just, on a 3X, that's a pretty nice use of the multiplier. I believe that was dial it down a notch, so kudos to you, dial it down a notch. On the flip side, there would be the multiply. There were actually many more contenders for the multiply of the week, because there were a few 3Xs like Le'Veon Bell who didn't produce. There were a few other multipliers that the player didn't show up nearly as well as they should. So this week I think we'll have to give the multiply to Andrew Hawkins of the Cleveland Browns. I believe Andrew produced nearly an identical stat line to you or I, which means he did not catch any balls in the NFL this week, which is impressive because he's actually on an NFL team as opposed to the two of us.
Yeah, he had as many fantasy points as you or I did, but he did have 2 more targets than either of us did. Unfortunately, a target is worth 0.0 fantasy points. So, yeah, unfortunately, there's a team that multiplied Andrew Hawkins and got absolutely nothing out of him. The other one that I wanted to mention real quick was we had a team that used a 3X on Eli Manning. There was a textbook use of a 3X. Drew Brees was the normal quarterback. Drew Brees was on bye in week 6. So, when you have Drew Brees, you're probably going to be starting him every single week, regardless of the matchup. So this is a situation where, okay, my regular all-star QB is on bye. I'm going to put in Eli Manning. He's got a pretty decent matchup against the Eagles. I'm going to 3X him. And, like I said earlier, QB's usually more consistent than the other positions as far as getting points. Eli, as everyone knows, the team got shut out. They had 0 points. He lost to the home receiver. And in the game, Eli only had 6-point-something fantasy points. But the ironic thing is, even with such a bad performance on the 3X of Eli, the rest of his roster stepped up, performed above projections, and he still won the week. So it's kind of a plus and minus. You're happy that you won the week and got the 11 wins, but at the same time, he could have instead used a 2X on his kicker or his defense, and he could have still won the week, and he could still have that 3X in his pocket. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting, and I will say the 3X might have been a bad move, but the 2X on Eli, you just mentioned Victor Cruz is gone for the season. That may have been your only chance to multiply Eli anyway, because going forward, you're not really going to want to. And back to the Andrew Hawkins, you mentioned the 2 targets. Well, if I'm in attendance at an NFL game and a ball is thrown out of bounds in my general direction, does that count as a target?
It depends on the official scorer for that game. I think some of them might be more liberal than others, and they might be willing to give it to you. But, yeah.
Okay, well then I'll have to check the official scoring to see if Andrew Hawkins this week has 2 more targets than I do. And so with that, we've covered the multiplier and multiply of the week, as we do every week here at Steel Scorpion Sports. Also, already given you the recap of the leagues and Mark's new team name, and did our Week 6 tidbits. So, Mark, I'll throw over to you, give you a chance to wrap up any loose items here before we sign off.
Yeah, I would just say that, being our first year, we've had a couple little bumps along the way that we've fixed pretty quickly, and keep looking on the site for improvements. We're still trying to add functionality to the site. Things that you're going to see this week are that we've added for the ad drop page. There's now also a column for the players' points in the last week. So you can see the total year-to-date points. You can see the projection for the upcoming week, and you can also see the points from the previous week. And all three of those columns are sortable as well, so you can say which of those columns are most important to you. And then also this week we'll be adding a multiplier detail tab to the scoreboard page, where you can just go and look at all the past multipliers for every team. So it's just all convenient, all in one place. You can see the list of every team and who they multiplied each week. And we have other functionality that we're looking to add as well. And by all means, if you have anything that you think would be a good idea to add, or a new functionality, or something that could improve the site, please feel free to shoot an email to contact@steelscorpionsports.com, and we'll be happy to take a look at it.
Yeah, and I know that multiplier tab you mentioned will be key as you come down the home stretch here for the playoffs, having been in multiplier leagues in the past, as you and I have, starting to strategize around when you're going to use multipliers, hold people off for playoff positioning. Understanding what they have is actually a key strategic element. And again, at Steel Scorpion Sports, we like to think we're all about strategy. We've taken the scheduling luck out of fantasy football. No longer can you finish with the second highest score and lose to the high score, and you end up 0-1, where someone with the second lowest score plays the lowest score and wins, and they're 1-0. We've taken that out of the game, so no longer does who you play matter. You play everyone. If you have the second highest score, you'll get the second most wins that week. We think that's a better way to play fantasy football. We've also added the multipliers, the mulligans, as we've discussed on this podcast. Great innovations to fantasy football. Again, strategy elements, when you use it, how many wins you can pick up. From the multiplier perspective, there's matching up your team with the schedule in the NFL and trying to figure out when the best matchup is for your quarterback, running back, receiver. So again, Steel Scorpion Sports, we like to think we're a better species of fantasy football. And I think if you see the all play, the multiplier, and the mulligan, I think play a season with us, you probably agree. And with that, Mark, I have nothing else to add on our Week 6 podcast. So signing off from San Diego, I'm Jeff Miller.
Signing off from San Jose, I'm Mark Eflin.